Every empire begins with a single act of defiance. For the American Railroad, it didn't start with a locomotive. It started with a 16-year-old boy, a borrowed $100, and a raw, predatory instinct that would eventually swallow the continent whole. Cornelius Vanderbilt was not a man of refinement. He was a creature of the docks, a rough-edged, profanity-laced ferryman who realized early on that in a growing nation, he who controls the movement of goods controls the pulse of the people. By the middle of the 19th century, Vanderbilt had earned the title the Commodore. He ruled the waves, commanding a fleet of steamships that made him the richest man in the country. But while others saw the ocean as the ultimate frontier, Vanderbilt was watching the horizon move inland. He saw the iron veins beginning to stretch across the soil. In a move that shocked the financial world, he liquidated his entire maritime empire. He sold the ships that made him a god to bet everything on a clattering, unproven technology, the railroad. His target was the New York Central. It was the water-level route, the most precious stretch of track in the world. But Vanderbilt didn't just want a seat at the table, he wanted to own the room. When rival directors refused to sell, the Commodore showed them the meaning of total war. In the dead of winter in 1867, Vanderbilt orchestrated his most infamous maneuver. He closed the Hudson River Bridge, the only rail entrance into New York City. He effectively strangled the nation's commercial heart. Freight rotted, passengers were stranded in the snow. The New York Central stock plummeted as investors panicked. As the board of directors begged for mercy, Vanderbilt bought them out for pennies on the dollar. He didn't just merge the lines, he established the rule of one. He was the first true American autocrat, wielding a personal fortune of $100 million, a sum so vast it rivaled the liquidity of the United States Treasury itself. The Commodore had built a fortress of steel and steam, but his success had created a vacuum, and in the shadows of Wall Street, a new breed of predator was watching. The Commodore had the iron, but he was about to meet the men who had the ink. In the late 1960s, Cornelius Vanderbilt set his sights on the Erie Railroad, the Scarlet Woman of Wall Street. It was the only line that could challenge his New York Central. To Vanderbilt, it was a business acquisition. To his enemies, it was the opportunity for the greatest heist in financial history. Vanderbilt's opponents were a trinity of treachery: Daniel Drew, the speculating deacon; Jim Fisk, the flamboyant showman; and Jay Gould, the quiet genius of greed. Daniel Drew had a trick up his sleeve called watered stock. The term comes from his days as a cattle driver, when he would salt the cows' feed to make them thirsty, then let them drink gallons of water right before they were weighed for sale. He applied the same logic to the Erie Railroad. As Vanderbilt began buying up every available share to corner the market, Gould and Fisk sat in the basement of the Erie headquarters with a printing press. Every time Vanderbilt bought 10,000 shares, they printed 20,000 more. They were selling Vanderbilt air. Vanderbilt spent $7 million, nearly $200 million today, buying illegal, fraudulent paper. When the Commodore realized he'd been played, he called for the law. In a scene out of a thriller, the Erie trio stuffed $7 million in greenbacks into suitcases, rowed across the Hudson River in a fog-drenched night, and barricaded themselves in a New Jersey hotel guarded by cannons. They didn't just escape, they bribed the entire New York State legislature to legalize the fraudulent stock they'd already sold. Vanderbilt, for the first time in his life, had been outmaneuvered. He reached a truce, but the Erie War changed the DNA of American business. It proved that in the new age of the barons, the man who controls the ledger is more powerful than the man who owns the tracks. If Vanderbilt was a sledgehammer, Jay Gould was a scalpel. He was a small, frail man with a beard that hid a perpetual scowl, but he possessed a mind that functioned like a high-speed computer a century before they existed. Gould began his career as a surveyor, literally walking the land. He knew the geography of America better than the men who governed it. While others were obsessed with building, Gould was obsessed with value extraction. He didn't care if a railroad was well run, he cared if its stock price could be manipulated. He understood that information was the ultimate commodity.
By seizing control of Western Union, he gained the power to intercept the communications of his rivals. He was the Mephistopheles of Wall Street, a man so hated that he couldn't walk the streets without bodyguards. His philosophy was simple: find a thriving company, short its stock, spread rumors of its bankruptcy through his network of friendly newspapers, and then buy the wreckage for nothing. He was a corporate raider before the term was invented. He once remarked, "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half." He was the architect of the first quiet war. He didn't need to close bridges like Vanderbilt. He just needed to whisper the right lie into the right ear at the right time.
In 1869, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk attempted the most audacious gamble in the history of the Republic. They tried to corner the United States gold market. At the time, the U.S. economy relied on gold for international trade. If Gould could control the supply of gold, he could control the price of every bushel of wheat and every mile of railroad track in America. But there was one obstacle: the U.S. Treasury. If the government sold its gold, the price would drop and Gould's corner would shatter. Gould used his most potent weapon: influence. He befriended President Ulysses S. Grant's brother-in-law, Abel Corbin. He used Corbin to get close to the president, whispering that a high gold price would help American farmers. It was a lie wrapped in patriotism. On Friday, September 24, 1869, Black Friday, the trap was sprung. The price of gold skyrocketed. Wall Street erupted in a literal riot. Men committed suicide on the trading floor as their fortunes evaporated in minutes. But Gould had a secret. He realized the Treasury was about to intervene before Fisk did. While Fisk was still shouting buy orders, Gould was quietly selling his entire position. When the government finally released $4 million in gold, the price crashed. Fisk was ruined. The nation's economy was crippled. But Jay Gould walked away with a profit of $11 million. He had broken the nation to line his pockets. The railroad barons were no longer just businessmen. They were a sovereign power, more influential than the White House itself. While the wolves of Wall Street fought over paper, a more physical, brutal war was being waged in the West. The Transcontinental Railroad was the greatest engineering feat of the 19th century, but it was built on a foundation of bone and corruption. Two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were locked in a race to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. The government paid them for every mile of track laid. This created a perverse incentive. The companies didn't care about the quality of the tracks. They cared about the speed of the greed. This was the era of the Credit Mobilier scandal. The owners of the Union Pacific created their own construction company, Credit Mobilier, and hired themselves to build the railroad at inflated prices. They were essentially stealing taxpayer money to pay themselves, then using that money to bribe congressmen to keep the subsidies flowing. On the ground, the cost was human. 15,000 Chinese immigrants worked in the Sierra Nevadas, tunneling through solid granite with nitroglycerin that exploded in their hands. They were paid less than white workers and lived in sub-zero temperatures. When the Golden Spike was finally driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, it was celebrated as a triumph of unity. In reality, it was the completion of a massive crime scene. The railroad had arrived, but it had brought with it a legacy of exploitation and the near extinction of the buffalo and the indigenous tribes whose land had been sliced in two by the iron horse. In 1873, the music stopped. The railroad bubble, inflated by decades of cheap government debt and fraudulent speculation, finally burst. It started with the collapse of J. Cook & Co., the most powerful bank in America, which had overextended itself trying to fund the Northern Pacific Railroad. When the bank closed its doors, it triggered a panic that shut down the New York Stock Exchange for 10 days. This was the Long Depression. 89 railroads went bankrupt. The barons, desperate to protect their profits, did what they always did. They pushed the cost onto the poor. They slashed wages by 20, 30, even 40%. In 1877, the workers finally broke. The Great Railroad Strike began in West Virginia and spread like wildfire to Chicago, St. Louis, and Pittsburgh.
It was the first national labor uprising in American history. The barons didn't negotiate. They called in the National Guard. In Pittsburgh, the state militia killed 20 people, including women and children. The workers responded by burning down the railroad yards, destroying $4 million in property. It was a civil war between labor and capital. The barons won the battle, but the Iron Throne was no longer viewed as a symbol of progress. It was viewed as a symbol of tyranny.
As the 19th century wound down, the era of the cowboy baron was ending. The chaotic, violent competition between men like Vanderbilt and Gould was bad for the one thing Wall Street loved most: stability. Enter John Pierpont Morgan. J.P. Morgan didn't build railroads, he Morganized them. He realized that if the railroads kept fighting rate wars, cutting prices to steal each other's customers, they would all eventually go bust. Morgan would invite the warring barons onto his yacht, the Corsair. He would sail into the middle of the harbor, anchor the boat, and tell them they weren't allowed to leave until they agreed to stop competing. This was the birth of the trust. Morgan replaced the colorful, predatory barons with faceless boards of directors accountable to his bank. He turned the railroads into a unified, efficient machine designed to generate consistent dividends for European investors. By 1900, Morgan controlled half of the railroad mileage in America. He had become the de facto central bank of the United States. He was so powerful that when the U.S. Treasury ran out of gold in 1895, it was Morgan, not the president, who bailed out the government. The railroad barons had been replaced by the banker. The barons and the bankers thought they were untouchable. They had bought the Senate, they had bought the courts, but they hadn't reckoned with a man like Theodore Roosevelt. In 1901, J.P. Morgan, James J. Hill, and E.H. Harriman formed the Northern Securities Company. It was a super monopoly that controlled every major railroad in the American West. It was the ultimate expression of Morganization. Morgan famously said, "I like a little competition, but I like combination more." But T.R., the accidental president, saw it differently. He viewed the Northern Securities Company as a direct threat to the sovereignty of the United States. In 1902, he did the unthinkable. He sued them under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Morgan went to the White House and told Roosevelt, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Roosevelt replied, "That we shall not do. We don't want to fix it up. We want to stop it." The case went to the Supreme Court. In 1904, the court ruled against the barons. The Northern Securities Company was dissolved. It was the first time in American history that the government had successfully broken the power of the great railroad empires. The era of unchecked power was over. The barons didn't fall to a revolution. They fell to a technology they refused to take seriously. In the early 20th century, a man named Henry Ford began mass-producing the automobile. Suddenly, the railroad wasn't the only way to move. At the same time, the government, tired of being bullied by the railroad trusts, began pouring billions of dollars into a new project, the interstate highway system. The railroads had become victims of their own success. They were overregulated, burdened by massive debt, and trapped in an old-world mindset. They had spent a century fighting each other for control of the tracks, while the world was moving to the road and the air. By the time the Great Depression hit in 1929, the great railroad empires were relics. The Iron Throne was rusting. The families that had once ruled America, the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, the Stanfords, found their fortunes evaporating. They had built fortresses of stone and steel, but they had forgotten that in capitalism, the only constant is change. The final lesson of the railroad barons is found in the fate of their descendants. In 1973, 120 members of the Vanderbilt family gathered for a reunion at Vanderbilt University. 100 years earlier, their patriarch was the richest man in the world, but at that reunion, among 120 direct descendants, there wasn't a single millionaire. The $100 million fortune, equivalent to hundreds of billions today, had been spent on mansions, parties, and ego. It was the Vanderbilt paradox.
They inherited the wealth, but they didn't inherit the hustle. The barons left us a complicated legacy. They built the infrastructure that made America a global superpower. They gave us the concept of the modern corporation and the stock market, but they also left a blueprint for corruption and the exploitation of the working class. They were men of immense vision and even greater greed. They proved that wealth is a choice, but power is a burden that eventually crushes its owner.
Today, we still ride the tracks they laid. We still walk past the libraries and universities that bear their names. We live in the world they built, but we must never forget the cost of the Iron Throne.